Welcome to the book of Exodus. This is literally one of my most favorite books to teach. I love this book. We're going to do it in 3 different segments. So this segment is going to give you a little bit of historical background and during their time in Egypt. The second segment is going to be them in the wilderness and at Sinai. And the third segment is going to be talking about the tabernacle. Again, these are broad brush pictures. We're not going into huge detail, but enough to give you some background so that you'll be able to look at the text and be able to interpret it through the eyes of the original reader and the original hearer. So the book of Exodus opens, it's after the death of Joseph, and it says, now there arose a Pharaoh in Egypt that did not remember Joseph. Now this is an interesting thing. This gets us asking, okay, who is this Pharaoh and why was it different than under Joseph? Well, during the time of Joseph, it was a dynasty of pharaohs that actually weren't Egyptian. They actually came from the land of Canaan, and they were called the Hyksos. And the Hyksos had conquered the then completely Egyptian pharaohs and began that dynasty, and that's called the 13th dynasty. They first showed up in the 11th dynasty, but they were in full power in the 13th dynasty or 13th dynasty of Egypt. And now these were foreign pharaohs. They brought in their own worship and they incorporated that into the worship of the Egyptian gods. And we don't have the time to go into great detail on the history of the Egyptian gods, but if you go to the Cairo Museum online, they've got some great information on understanding how the Egyptians, through the various dynasties, worshipped their gods and who their gods were. And that's really helpful. So these were the pharaohs, that were ruling during the time of Joseph and after Joseph died. And then in the 14th through the 18th dynasties, those pharaohs then kicked out the Hyksos. They defeated them, and all the Hyksos pharaohs went back to Canaan. And that's what it says, then there arose a pharaoh who did not remember Joseph. These are the ones that were after the Hyksos. That's why it's kind of important to understand that. Now there's 2 different datings of the time of the Exodus. Some have it in around 1446 BC, and some have it a bit later at like around like 1300s, during the times of Ramses II. I'm going to be presenting the idea of the Exodus during 1446 BC, and this is the reason why. It seems to fit the criteria more. I'm going to talk about the pharaohs during that time. During the time, we have Tutmosis II. He was the second son of Amenmos. He shouldn't have been pharaoh, but the oldest son, Tutmos I, died, and he became the heir. He was married to Hatshepsut, and during Egyptian history, she was the first female pharaoh. After Tutmos II died, she became pharaoh for a while, and she even went as far as to put a fake beard on her face and have her hair cut like the men's, so that she would be taken and respected. Then we have Amenhotep, who is the pharaoh, I think, of the Exodus. It says that an interesting thing is that he was never able to carry out any military operations because he had no military. His father, Amenhotep I, was able to do a lot of military things. He was one of the sons of Tutmos II. But Amenhotep II was not able to because he had no military. And I want to present the question to you, why wouldn't he have had any military? Well, it says that all of Pharaoh's army died in the Red Sea. Then we have Tutmosis IV, who is the son of Amenhotep II. And again, he wasn't the firstborn, but his older brother had mysteriously died in the night on a time of a great plague of the people of Egypt. Again, what would that correspond to? It would correspond very well to the final plague that God brought upon Egypt, where all firstborn in the land were killed if they did not have the blood of the lamb covering their door. So that's kind of why I go with the dating of the Exodus around 1446. It seems to line up pretty well. During the time of Ramses, which is a later date, Egypt was in great power, and it doesn't show anywhere that Ramses actually had any sort of struggles or sacrifices that happened to him at all. But that is the time that the great Ten Commandments movie has the Exodus is occurring. And you can look it up, and I'm sure there's arguments for that. I'm just going to stick with this date. So the book of Exodus opens with the mention that there's the new Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph, and that the people suffered greatly under him. And that then the people of Israel were multiplying, and Pharaoh was afraid, and he told the midwives to kill all the boy children. But the midwives feared God, and they did not, and they continued to multiply. And God blessed the midwives. And then there was this little baby boy named Moses. And his mother put him in a basket and hid him in the river. And as we know the story, then Pharaoh's sister found him and raised him to be the next Pharaoh. So Moses grew up in the house of Pharaoh until a day when he realized who he was. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Jew, an Israelite, and he went out and he killed the Egyptian. And Pharaoh found out about it, and Moses was forced to flee into the wilderness. Now Moses was 40 years old when that happened, and he had to go out in the wilderness. And he went to the land of Midian. And there the story goes on, but he found a wife and he had children. And for 40 years he lived in Midian, and he was quite happy. Then in chapter 3, so chapter 3, Moses is 80 years old. He is 80 years old. And he sees a bush burning. And a voice comes out of the bush and says, I am God. Take off your shoes. This is a holy place. And Moses is terrified. Now, an interesting thing to remember, the people of Israel had been living in Egypt for over 400 years. They were more Egyptian than anything else. They didn't know the name of their God. They didn't know much about their God. So when Moses asks God and says, who are you? God gives him the absolute, brilliant, perfect answer. I am that I am. That is God's name. Elohim. Not that I was, not that I will be, but I am. And we look ahead in the book of John when they come to arrest Jesus, and he said, who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus. He said, I am that I am. Elohim. And that is why they all fall down. That is the name of God. Prior to this time, the people of Israel did not have a name for their God. They did not know what to call him. He now has a name. He becomes a person in their life. And the book of Exodus is where they learn to see the power and the might of their God. Moses is sent back into Egypt. Before Pharaoh, God says, I'm going to do miracles. I'm going to do signs. And Pharaoh is going to harden his heart. And he is not going to let you go until finally it becomes so difficult that he sends you out. And he not only will send you out, but he will send you out with jewels and with money and animals and everything. So Moses goes back. And we know the story. He stands before Pharaoh. He casts down his staff. It turns into a snake. All the magicians cast down their staffs. They become snakes. But Moses' snake eats all the other snakes. Then Moses strikes the river Nile, and it turns to blood. And the magicians strike other water, and it all turns to blood. And Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and then becomes the 10 plagues. Each one's harder, each one more difficult, each one more severe. And roughly a third of the way through the plagues is where God defines where the people of Israel don't suffer the consequences that the rest of the people do. Until the final plague is the death of the firstborn. This is the Passover, where God says, okay, you go in your houses. You're going to take a perfect lamb. You're going to kill it, and you're going to take the blood, and you're going to put the blood of the lamb over your doorposts. And you're going to eat the lamb all in one place with your shoes on and your clothes on, ready to go, because they are going to cast you out of Egypt. They're going to send you out. And the angel of death will pass over all the houses that have the blood of the lamb over the doorpost. And that's what happened that night. And it wasn't just Israelites that were saved that night. There were also Egyptians that were saved. They believed in the power of the God of Israel. And they put the blood over the doorpost. And they were rescued, and they were set aside. And later on, many hundreds of years later, there was the perfect Lamb of God, who was the perfect Passover sacrifice, Jesus, the Son of God. And his blood was shed, and it saved multitudes from the angel of death. And that's why Passover is such an important festival for the Jews to remember how God delivered them, but also for us Gentiles who are brought into the kingdom to remember that Jesus, it all was a foreshadow of Jesus as the perfect Passover lamb. So they're cast out, they're sent out. Pharaoh sends them out, and they are left, and they're standing finally before the Red Sea, and they're terrified because they hear Pharaoh's army coming behind them. And they're crying out, and they're saying, Moses, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you have to kill us here? And God tells Moses, wait and see. And God splits the sea in half, and the people go through on dry land. And Pharaoh's army comes following after them. And the waters come and cover all of Pharaoh's army. There's none left. And the people have seen the great miracles and the great signs of God, how he delivered them from their enemies. And God continued to lead his people by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And they would go as the cloud went. They followed the cloud. And when the cloud stayed put, that they would stay put. And when the cloud went forward, they would go forward. But that's how God brought them out of Egypt and into the place of where they could then hear God. They were separated from the world, and they were able to hear fully from God. Now the plagues, there's different thoughts about the plagues. Was it relation to the Egyptian gods? Maybe, because they had thousands and thousands of gods. And you can go to the Cairo Museum online. It will tell you about the different Egyptian gods, and you can come up with the information, and you can then incorporate that into your interpretations on your charts. The next segment will be talking about Mount Sinai and the law coming down to the people.